Okay, so for this deep dive, you really went all out, huh? You want to talk about the Manhattan Project, but you've given us like standard history book stuff, but then also parts of a podcast that was popular back then, American History Tellers, I think it was called, yeah. And then even just like random ads from that time period for like true crime podcasts and Diddy, like
I
what?
know, right? It's a really interesting mix. I
Yeah.
mean, you have like this huge world-changing scientific project happening, but at the same time, like normal life is just chugging along.
Yeah.
People still want to be entertained and all that.
Yeah, it's kind of wild. It's like you dug up a time capsule and buried it inside a top secret bunker.
Aha, I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think for this deep dive, we should take advantage of that unique mix of sources you've given us.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're not just going to like rehash the basic Manhattan Project story that everybody already knows. We're going to use all this material to try and like really get into the nitty-gritty, the drama, the tough decisions people had to make, even like some of the funny stuff.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we could talk about the science, but also like what it was actually like to be a part of this thing,
Yeah.
the personal sacrifices, the politics, the whole nine yards.
Exactly. So let's set the stage. It's 1942, World War II's in full swing, and the US is basically in a race against Nazi Germany to build an atomic bomb. Enter the Manhattan Project, this massive top secret endeavor unlike anything the world had ever seen.
Right, and leading this whole thing were two really interesting guys. General Leslie Groves, who was like this super strict military man, just wanted results, no messing around. And then you have J. Robert Oppenheimer.
Oh yeah, Oppenheimer, the brilliant physicist. But the podcast you sent mentions that he had some like risky political leanings or something like that.
Yeah, he had ties to communists, which
Mhm.
back then was a huge red flag, especially
Yeah.
for a project dealing with something as top secret and important as this.
Oh, for sure. So right off the bat, you've got this tension brewing. Groves needs Oppenheimer's brainpower to get this thing done, but he can't fully trust him. I mean, talk about a recipe for drama.
Absolutely, and with the fate of the world hanging in the balance, too.
Right. And then there's Los Alamos itself, a secret city built from scratch in the middle of the New Mexico desert.
Can you imagine? All these brilliant scientists, many of them used to like of the freedom of universities, of suddenly living in basically shacks under constant pressure to create a weapon that would change the course of history.
You're like, talk about culture shock.
A total culture shock. And then on top of that, you've got Groves' obsession with secrecy. He was all about compartmentalization.
So, like, scientists would be working on a tiny piece of the project with no clue about the bigger picture.
Exactly. And that created a lot of tension and isolation, especially for someone like Oppenheimer, who loved collaboration and open discussion. I mean, imagine working on a puzzle, but you don't even know what the final image is supposed to be.
That's crazy.
Right. And in one of the podcasts, they talk about this physicist, Robert Serber. His job was to brief new arrivals at Los Alamos, like give them a crash course on nuclear fission and how to build a bomb.
Whoa. What do you think that would have been like to be in that room, suddenly realizing the magnitude of what you're involved in, the potential consequences? Must have been mind blowing.
Totally. And probably terrifying, too. It really shows you how intense the secrecy and pressure were. And speaking of pressure, they weren't just racing against time, but also trying two different ways to build the bomb: the gun method and the implosion method.
Okay, so the gun method basically sounds like what it is. You shoot a piece of uranium into another one, creating a critical mass, which starts a chain reaction.
Yeah, but the problem with that was the risk of it going off accidentally.
Yeah.
Not exactly ideal when you're dealing with something as powerful as an atomic bomb.
Yeah, that's like a seriously bad oops moment. So the implosion method, they were trying to compress plutonium with explosives to reach critical mass.
Right. Much trickier, though. It needed perfect symmetry to work, and that's way harder to pull off than it sounds. But if they could do it, it would be more powerful than the gun method.
Wow, so it sounds like they were really pushing the limits of science with all this. They had teams working on the math experiments, new materials, even just figuring out the best explosives.
And all this under incredible time pressure. It's amazing they managed to do any of it, let alone figure out how to make a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, seriously. But there was another layer of stress too, espionage.
Right. It was war, after all. Even though the Soviets and Americans were allies at that point, there was still a lot of mistrust between them. The U.S. did not want their atomic secrets getting out, especially not to the Soviets.
Enter Colonel Boris Pash.
Yep, he was a counterintelligence officer, and he was super suspicious of Oppenheimer and his communist connections, especially after that whole thing with Oppenheimer's ex-girlfriend, Jean Tatlock, who was a known communist.
So basically, you've got this Cold War spy thriller playing out in the middle of World War II.
Exactly. It shows how intertwined everything was back then, science, politics, ideology. And poor Groves, he's stuck in the middle. He needs Oppenheimer, but he also has to worry about him leaking information. I can't even imagine the stress.
Yeah, it must have been insane. But hold on a sec. We've been talking about Los Alamos this whole time, but there's another super important part of the Manhattan Project happening somewhere else.
Oh yeah, Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Another secret city built for the project.
And this is where they were making the fuel for the bomb, right? Enriching uranium.
Exactly. And this is where we meet the Calitron girls. These young women, many of them just out of high school, operating these massive machines called calitrons that separated uranium isotopes.
And the crazy part is, most of them had no idea what they were actually doing.
Right. They were just told it was important for the war effort.
So while the scientists are figuring out how to design the bomb, these women are on the front lines of production without even knowing it. Talk about being a part of history without realizing it.
It really is amazing when you think about it. And to understand what they were doing, we need to talk about isotopes for a second.
Okay, hit me with it.
So isotopes are atoms of the same element, but with a different number of neutrons. And for the bomb, they needed to separate out a very specific uranium, uranium-235 to use as fuel.
Got it.
And the calitrons used super strong magnets to do this separation, which was a long and tedious process and honestly kind of dangerous too.
Yeah, the podcast mentions one of the Calitron girls seeing a worker get pinned by one of the magnets.
Oof. Yeah, definitely dangerous. These women worked long hours in tough conditions and didn't even know what they were really contributing to. They were definitely the unsung heroes of the Manhattan Project.
Totally. But you know, another person who doesn't always get enough credit is Niels Bohr.
Ah, yes. The legendary physicist. He managed to escape Nazi-occupied Denmark and arrived at Los Alamos in late '43.
I bet the scientists there were thrilled to have him. I mean, he was a hero to many of them.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And he was impressed with how far they'd come.
Yeah.
But he also brought some serious concerns with him. He was worried about what would happen after the war, He thought there might be an arms race with the Soviets.
Which is exactly what happened. It's kind of crazy to think that he predicted that way back then.
It really is. And he had this radical idea. What if they were just open with the Soviets about the whole thing? About atomic energy, I mean.
Wow. Imagine if they had actually tried to cooperate instead of all the secrecy.
Yeah, what if? Maybe it could have prevented the Cold War and all that nuclear tension.
It's a pretty mind-blowing thought. But yeah, like you said, it was wartime. Nobody was really in the mood for sharing, especially not something like this.
Right. It was just too risky. Roosevelt and Churchill both shot down the idea pretty quickly.
Makes you wonder if things could have been different, though.
Definitely. But while Bohr was pushing for openness, there was someone else at Los Alamos working with a totally different agenda.
Klaus Fuchs, right. The Soviet spy.
Yeah. It's a complicated story. He was brilliant, no doubt, but also a committed communist who really didn't trust the Western powers at all.
Yeah, the podcast mentions that he thought sharing atomic secrets with the Soviets would help balance things out and maybe even prevent future wars.
Right, he thought it was the best thing for humanity. Hard to argue with that goal, but obviously his methods were, well, a little problematic.
Yeah, hindsight's 20/20. It's easy to judge him now knowing how things turned out. But you got to try and see it from his perspective, too.
Absolutely. Anyway, the podcast doesn't get into the details of how they caught him, but they do talk about this crucial meeting he had with Harry Gold, the Soviet courier, in June of '45. Think about the risks he was taking, the weight of those secrets. I mean, that's some serious spy stuff right there.
It had to be terrifying. And they met in Santa Fe, I think, right?
Yeah. Fuchs just hands over all this top-secret info plans for the plutonium bomb, confirmation that the Trinity test was about to happen.
Yeah.
It's crazy to think that while everyone at Los Alamos is working towards this test, Fuchs is giving it all away to the Soviets.
And he wasn't the only one spying for the Soviets either, right?
Nope. At least 3 others that we know of. It's kind of unsettling how deep their network was. Makes you wonder how much they actually knew about the project.
Seriously. And it really makes you think about trust,
Yeah.
Especially during wartime. How do you keep things secret when you also need people to work together? How do you know who to trust?
Yeah, it's a timeless dilemma, isn't it? And those questions are still relevant today, maybe even more so with all the information flying around online.
For sure. But let's get back to the main story. So by the spring of '45, they've got the bomb designs figured out, the fuel's coming in from Oak Ridge and Hanford, but they still haven't tested a complete atomic bomb.
Talk about pressure. They'd come so far, overcome so many obstacles, but that final test was still looming.
And Oppenheimer was pushing for a full-scale test, but Groves wasn't so sure at first.
Yeah, plutonium was super scarce at that point.
Uh-huh.
and they needed to get a working bomb ASAP. Plus, what if the test failed?
Right. What if they dropped a dud on an enemy city? It would give the enemy a chance to figure it out, maybe even copy it and use it against them. That's a risk nobody wanted to take.
Exactly. And they also needed to know how powerful the bomb actually was.
Mm-hmm.
The math is one thing, but actually seeing it explode is something else entirely.
So they gave the test a code name, Trinity.
Kind of a poetic name, isn't it?
Yeah.
Given what they were about to unleash.
Yeah, it's pretty fitting. But as they were getting ready for Trinity, something crazy happened. Roosevelt died. And Truman, who knew practically nothing about the Manhattan Project, suddenly became president.
What a time to take office, right? A new president with a war already in progress, and then this top-secret project with unimaginable power.
And to make things even more complicated, Germany surrendered.
Yeah, suddenly the whole reason for the Manhattan Project was gone.
It's like everyone at Los Alamos must have just stopped and been like, wait, what now? Was it still ethical to continue? Did they even need the bomb anymore?
Tough questions. And those questions are still debated today, but at the time, the war with Japan was still raging on.
And Truman, along with a lot of military leaders, saw the bomb as the quickest way to end the war and save American lives.
Right. So the project continued, but now was even more urgent. They moved the Trinity test up to July 16th, 1945, just one day before Truman was supposed to meet Stalin at the Potsdam Conference.
Oh, wow. So now it wasn't just about testing the bomb, it was a political move, too. A way to show off American power to the Soviets.
Exactly. Talk about pressure. And on top of all that, they were still reeling from the Fuchs betrayal. Finding out that they had a Soviet spy right under their noses must have been devastating.
Absolutely. And the podcast really highlights the significance of that meeting between Fuchs and Goal in Santa Fe. It shows how even in a project as big and important as this, personal beliefs and actions can have huge unintended consequences.
Right. Fuchs's decision to spy directly contributed to the Cold War and the nuclear arms race. But anyway, let's focus on the Trinity test itself.
Yeah.
July 16th, 1945, at a super remote site in the New Mexico desert, they built this huge steel tower to hold a bomb, which they nicknamed the Gadget.
I can't even imagine what the atmosphere was like that day. Excitement, fear, and just the sheer awe of what they were about to do.
It must have been incredible. Years of work culminating in this one moment. But nobody knew for sure what would happen when they detonated the bomb.
So the countdown starts the flash at the shockwave that literally knocks some people off their feet.
And then that mushroom cloud, rising miles into the air, a symbol of a new era.
It's hard to even grasp what it must have felt like to witness that. Relief that it worked, of course, but also probably some terror at the power they had unleashed.
Definitely. The Trinity test changed everything. It marked the beginning of the atomic age, an age defined by both amazing potential and the very real threat of our own destruction.
And the scientists knew that. Oppenheimer even quoted a line from the Hindi scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Talk about a heavy burden to carry. They had done what they set out to do, but at what cost?
It's a question that still haunts us today. The Trinity test was more than just a scientific experiment. It was a turning point for all of humanity. We had to face the fact that we could destroy ourselves.
And of course, just a few weeks later, the world saw that destructive power firsthand in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah, those bombings ended World War II, but the human cost was unimaginable. It was a stark reminder of what they had created.
Yeah.
You know, the power to destroy entire cities.
It's so strange to think that while people were listening to radio ads for like toothpaste and stuff, this was happening. It's like two completely different worlds.
It really shows how fast everything changed. They went from racing to build the bomb to actually using it in just a few weeks. The world was never the same after that.
Yeah, the Manhattan Project changed everything. It ushered in the nuclear age. We had all this amazing potential, but also the very real possibility of wiping ourselves out.
And it completely changed the balance of power, too. The Cold War started almost immediately with the U.S. and the Soviet Union pointing nuclear weapons at each other.
Mutually assured destruction. It's terrifying to think that for decades we were on the brink of nuclear war. It could have happened at any moment.
And the thing is, the Manhattan Project wasn't just about science. It was a social, political, and moral turning point for humanity.
We had to face the fact that we could destroy ourselves. And that's a heavy burden to carry. What do you think is like the biggest takeaway from all of this?
That's a tough one. For me, it's the realization that knowledge, especially knowledge as powerful as this, is a double-edged sword. You can use it for good or for evil.
I agree. The Manhattan Project is a cautionary tale, but it's also a testament to human ingenuity. It shows how important it is to think about the ethics of scientific advancements, the need for international cooperation, and just how careful we have to be with powerful technology.
Absolutely.
So, if you're interested in learning more about all this, I highly recommend checking out the books and documentaries listed in the source material. There's so much more to discover about the scientists, the politics, the impact of it all.
And keep asking questions. Keep thinking about the ethical implications. Remember the human stories behind the science. The more we understand the past, the better equipped we are to face the future.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll see you next time.